And thanks to everybody for coming into the committee today, and Joe for joining us remotely. The overlaps and intersectionalities of disability and mental health are really complex and obviously impact each individual differently. So the insights from the sector, the issues that you and those you represent encounter are really important in helping us understand the larger context and its impact on people. So yeah, thanks very much for coming in today. My first questions are for Joe McGrath. You pointed out that it's important for the HSE's mental health and intellectual disability team to talk to people with intellectual disabilities themselves so that they can tell them what services they want for their mental health. Could you tell us more about how the HSE can work with you on this? And my second question for Joe is, you said the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act doesn't do everything that the UNCRPD says it should about recognising our right to make decisions. Could you tell us a bit more about that as well? Yes,
the mental you need to be able to link in all of the supports from the assisted decision making to the mental health as well, because if all of these things are linked up through different ministers and one not talking to each other. When we campaign for rights for people with intellectual disabilities, we have to go to 2 or 3 different ministers to get our point of view across.
Ridiculous. My next questions are for the National Advocacy Service. You discussed how interaction between CHOs and mental health services increases rights restrictions placed on disabled people in the community, and you cited the case of Bill. Could you elaborate on that point? And we encounter this issue often whereby poor communication and engagements between state services, in this case with the HSE itself, have really negative impacts on individuals and families. And then you also articulated the importance of the Assisted Decision Making Act, giving statutory recognition to the role of independent advocacy, which enables such advocates to participate in decision making and to have the right to access information and ensure that the voice of the person affected is protected. So to my reading of your statement, there's a very real danger that the service that you provide could easily be disregarded under the Act. If you could just elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, I might take your second question first, Deputy. So the Act, the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act, and even with the amending legislation, still does not make any specific legislative provision for advocacy, so there's no definition of advocacy in the Act. There is one in the draft Code of Practice, and as I mentioned in my opening statement. So in effect, I suppose if you like, all the other players involved, you know, individuals themselves as relevant persons, the different tiers of decision-making supporters, as well as recognition of other kind of state players, all are defined and all have clear functions and responsibilities under the Act, but there is no reference to advocacy. However, when you read the Code of Practice and you also look at the DSS's own predictions in terms of demand, it's quite clear that there will be a substantial increase in demand for advocacy services. The specific point we were making was that because the only recourse we would then have should there be an issue about access to advocacy would be to make a complaint to the Decision Support Service, say about the activities of a decision-making representative. They could disregard advocacy services, and we've had that experience over a long number of years because of our non-statutory basis, is that many actors who have statutory functions or regulatory function can disregard what an advocate is saying. And the importance of that is not about the advocacy service per se. The importance of it is because the advocate is the only independent person who's providing that support to the individual. The individual may have very strong family support, but that doesn't mean to say that the family members are not without their own interests. They may have strong informal advocacy from their service providers, say from the HSE, but again, there can be, you know, either a perception or a real conflict of interest there. So the advocate is the only one, by the nature of how the organisation is established, how it's funded and how the service is provided, is the only truly independent service. So it is a real risk that we would have that when the Act is commenced, that because it's not stitched in and not embroidered in fully into the Act, that could happen. So we have been looking for that legislative amendment. Unfortunately, however, it's not yet been incorporated. In relation to your first question about that kind of interaction between state services, it's absolutely true. And again, it's long been our experience of people who have both mental health issues or psychosocial disabilities and another disability type falling between the stools and not being able to access appropriate supports. It's particularly the case for people with intellectual disabilities and mental health issues that there is often a disinterest by the HSE to provide those services, and it often comes down to how the HSE's own funding is structured, so that they will have a mental health budget, they will have a disability budget, and they're trying to contain that budget, and if they see that another side of the HSE, another division, could provide that funding, that will be the position they would take. So it's part of the bigger picture that was discussed by Bear in your earlier questions. I had responses to the Senator's questions about the overarching structure and how it's all integrated, but also in a very practical how services are delivered, how they're operated. It's really critical that we try to get out of those silos and actually, say that you have to look at the individual and packaging for them as opposed to packages out of budgets.
Yeah. Chair, can I just ask one quick question to mental health reform as well? Thank you. It's also in relation to the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act amendment. And you mentioned that it will not fully realise the rights of people with psychosocial disabilities in relation to depriving of their liberty. And it's one of the issues we discussed in relation to the amendment bill this year. And you did elaborate a bit in response to Senator Siri Carney, but I'm just wondering for the committee, if just on the record, you could outline mental health reform's key concerns with the Act as it stands at the moment.
So I suppose with the advanced healthcare directives, that's something that when you can plan for future healthcare issues, physical healthcare or mental healthcare, and the assisted decision. One of the things that the Assisted Decision Making Act is going to do is to put advanced healthcare directives, that they will be legally binding for people, for everyone in physical health, if you're receiving voluntary mental health care treatment. So absolutely everyone, if you have sat down with your supports or advocates and made up a plan for the type of treatment that you don't. So for example, electroconvulsive therapy, you might say, that's not something that I want, or these medications, do not work for me. Every single person will have their rights and their will and preferences respected unless they are detained under Part 4 of the Mental Health Act or the Criminal Law Insanity Act. So every single other person will have the right to have their advanced healthcare directives followed in healthcare settings, except people who are involuntarily detained. And in the work that we've done around it, you're more likely to make advanced planning for your care if you've been through a mental health crisis before. It's not something you kind of necessarily sit around on a Saturday night thinking, well, what will we do in case something happens next year, So you're making informed choices about your treatment and your body when you're well. I know that there's a lot of mental health admissions are readmissions. So again, it's that thing of, if we're going to be trauma informed and recovery oriented in our approach to mental health care, and people with intellectual disabilities and psychosocial disabilities, then as Louise said, it's about listening to them and their voices. And at the moment, there's going to be a cohort of people excluded from that right.
Yeah, and just a final comment, I think when we were going through that process of the assisted decision-making stuff, it was unacceptable in many ways, but it was very rushed, was one of them, and it's a very complex piece of legislation. I personally found it very difficult to get my head around in such a short period of time. There was no plain English version of the legislation for people to understand more easily, and all of that rush, it turned out, was for nothing. So it's good to have kind of a further discussion about it here today, and things like the Advanced Healthcare Directive. I think you explained it really well. People often make them, I think, during times where you might have, early symptoms of Alzheimer's or dementia, and your decisions are respected. So to consider that somebody's decisions wouldn't be respected, I think that example was something that made it easier for me to understand. Not to mention the kind of issues around the codes of practice and the absence of kind of engagement with DPOs, all of those things. It's good to have it discussed further again today. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks.